Latoya, I'm gonna ask you a question because the author, I mean, she brings up a new terminology that I had not considered before, and it stood out to me as it relates to this James Baldwin quote, which is extremely important to when you think about the context of the world we live in now. But we understand that there was the period of Jim Crow, where Black people underwent this severe oppression, and some of it that still actually lingers into our modern context today. But when she introduced Jane Crow, I said, wow, that's the first time I've ever heard anything like that. But it goes into the depths of what that experience is like in the environments of work, let alone societal barriers and challenges. And so from your lens, working with, women in an HR position, can you give us some of the things that some of the blind spots that may not be seeing or we might be missing that occur when we think about oppression and discrimination towards women in the work environment?
Yeah, this is such a, oh gosh, we
I
could
know that's a
spend,
load. I gave you a loaded one, but
man,
I've
I'm
been
like,
waiting to talk to
oh,
somebody about this
okay.
one.
Okay, because we could spend like a whole 3 hours just on this. And it
Right.
actually ties very well into the chapter where Minda talks about, feeling that I can, as a woman of color, I can be the only one at this table.
Mm,
Because when we talk about the weaponization of white women in the workplace, that's a trope they use as well
mm-hmm.
to groom a Black gatekeeper or a Latina gatekeeper, so that just when you think you got some camaraderie with your senior manager, your senior director, who's a Black woman or who's a woman of color, lo and behold, she is also a mean girl. And
Mm,
she's also been groomed in this space of, the other mean girls. There's a couple things that I can lend here. Certainly, I know Rachel Cargill has written about it, and she talks about how feminism in itself is typically a package of like white supremacy and stilettos, and
mm,
how the space where we go our separate ways in an office structure, right? So women as a collective tend to fight the same things in the door, and they land on sexism. But then there's a point, especially when we get to the middle management stage, if we're talking about a traditional office corporate setting,
yeah.
there's a level of that video game that no one tells us about, and it's where we go our separate ways, where we're
Mm-hmm.
no longer fighting just sexism together. We're fighting sexism and racism. And
Mm,
statistics have showed us that white women, when the fight is sexism or racism, white women will jump in the playing field with their white male counterparts, and now it's no longer we're in this together. And that message in itself, if you don't have enough self-awareness, if you don't understand the lay of the land culturally in the place that you work, that's a gut punch, right? That's like getting T-boned. You cross the light, you think you got clearance, and here's the Dodge Ram that tears up your car. And that's a hard place to be. We go back to some of the trauma that is perpetuated. That has a lot to do with it. A lot of women of color look to their white female counterparts as allies, but they're not walking the allyship walk. They're not talking the
mm.
allyship talk, unless we're talking about gender parity. But when we start talking about racism, all hands are out.
Come on, that's the truth. Listen, we're gonna put some fire in the chat for you. You dropped new terminology on us. Somebody is gonna go to work this week and recognize that there are white supremacy and stilettos is present in their office space. So shout out to you for giving us that gem. But you're right. I love the way that the Minda draws the parallel towards the election of 2016 when Hillary Clinton unfortunately lost to Donald Trump, but just to how many white women abandoned women of color in their plight in this, in society, right? You can look at it from, empowerment, you can look at it from employment, you can look at it towards legislation to protect women, and how when the issue of race became the dividing factor, we saw an exodus from support. But let's keep moving. Let's keep moving. This is great. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Latoya. That was so powerful. Wow, white supremacy and stilettos.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing, amazing.
Jane
So
Crow.
So now we're moving on to talking about the wage gap. So we just pulled this statistic. So in 2017, the Institute for Women's Policy Research and National Domestic Workers Alliances reported that 80% of Black mothers are their household's breadwinner, while only 50% of white women are their household's breadwinner. So that statistic right there, like that is a huge, huge difference. So we just pulled up apart from the book where Minda says, this is just one of the many reasons the wage gap upsets me. Many of us are the first people in our families to graduate from college, the first in our family to go from lower income to middle or upper middle class. It's a wonderful feeling, but comes with a lot of responsibility. Many of our families struggled for decades to overcome economic and social inequalities caused by inadequate access to education and housing, and generations of incarceration. Black and brown women tend to hold their families up on their shoulders so the entire family can advance. Our financial expectations aren't always discussed in the Black community. It's another one of those unwritten rules that seem to guide the way women of color live their lives. So that is a very powerful statement. I know, like for myself, I'm a first generation immigrant, the first person in my family to graduate from college. And I was definitely not handed, any type of silver spoon or, any leg up. So, we have the fact that we already have that, 400 years, that we are set back. And then you have the fact that we have a wage gap. And one thing that was so powerful for me in this book was that she talked about the fact that women of color, we don't discuss our salaries because we're taught you don't talk about money. And for me, I've never spoken about how much I make in any of, my different, careers, different jobs that I held. But it wasn't until I did have a conversation, with my white coworker where she told me, oh, I make this amount. And, we had the same education, the same experiences. Most of the times I was the one that had, a little bit more experience, or I brought more qualifications to the table. And they're making like several dollars more than me, you know what I mean, per hour. So you would never know because we don't talk about it, because that's what we're told. So it's just like, man, the ideology of like, don't talk about money, that kind of holds us back. Because you're just there, in secret thinking like, oh yeah, I'm good, but not having that conversation, you're blocking your blessings.
Latoya, can you speak to that from an HR standpoint? Because I know that, speaking of experiences of entering places where when you're one of like a few, there's like, oh, we don't talk about salary. And the reason why, now that I've worked in education for long enough to see, the reason why they do that is because there is a different pay that other people are starting with. And so in order to keep that taboo or to keep that lie going, it's easier to silence the person who is getting the short end of the stick, so to speak, so that they won't cause a disruption to that economic oppression that exists in that environment.
Yeah. How many times you want me to say agent of white supremacy?
Come on.
Today. How many? You want to make a tally? I was on my phone because I was looking for a most recent stat, but I don't know that I'll be able to pull it up off the top of my head. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting, Greg, when we talk from HR standards. Now keep in mind, with my HR background, I have a lot of experience, kind of what is considered in the front of the house, which may be more transactional. Right. So benefits and administration, wealth management, training and documentation, recruiting, onboarding, those are really my jams in the house. A little bit of employee relations as well. The back end of the house, we start to talk about strategy, vision, payroll, right? Setting up career ladders. What does it, what are the various, I don't know the word I'm trying to, swim lanes, if you will, for this one position. So you have software engineer 1. What makes software engineer 1 different than software engineer 2 when it comes to pay? The idea that, okay, well, if employee, part of this employee handbook is we don't discuss salaries. That way, as a corporation, when I have a pay disparity, when there are pay inequities, I don't have to be called on the carpet often, right? I don't put myself out there. So in the state of New York said, listen, all job descriptions need to have a salary range. You can't wait until you talk to the potential candidate when they're getting ready to, sign their onboarding, forms and documents to talk about pay. It's a great way to build this, buzzworthy term in our time. It's a great way to build allyship amongst my friends, like my homies and who I kiki it up with on the weekends. We all know how much we make.
Yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
because there's healing when we can talk about money. To Magna's point, we don't talk about money because, you know, we were raised in what Minda talked about. You know, you don't tell your business. You don't tell your
Hmm.
business like that. That's how much money you make is what you make.
Right.
Because coming from something you mentioned earlier, Greg, that Jane Crow and that Jim Crow mentality,
Hmm.
yeah, we stay with that enslaved mindset when what I got should only be for me and you don't need to know. And how did you get what you got over there? Actually, when we open up the conversation and normalize our incomes, our salaries, now we can get help when we don't know how to negotiate. When we don't know, well, I'm reading this contract, like, is this right? Is this a figure that I should accept? When we normalize the money conversation, then we can get closer and closer to closing that wage gap.